less than we anticipated, but it's still a chunk of change. But they when I picked him up, they said to me, they're like, he's gonna be like a little drunk man. I'm like, oh great, that's what I needed, a hyperactive drunk man running around my house. So
I gave my cat a sedative once, and it was anything but that. Gave him a sedative
mm,
for the vet to come, and he was falling over, walked through his food bowl and knocked that over, and he was literally falling over in his tracks. I'm like, never again.
yeah, well, the technician called me at like 12:30. She says he's out of surgery and he should be okay for you to pick up at 4. He's gonna be here for a while until he wakes up. And then she called me like 5 minutes later. She's like, "So Wallace woke up." I was like, "Of course he did, little punk." But yeah, but now he's zonked out. He just ate for the first time in a day, and now he's just tuckered out. So I probably could go in the room, but I don't want to take the chance of him getting into trouble.
No.
So I get this very low res version of me. So, so Dan, was that your daughter that was in Wyoming that was with you guys yesterday on
Yes.
Sunday? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And her
She's
name is
Mac. Sarah. No
Sarah.
H.
Okay. Very cool. So we got Heather and Mark hanging out safely back from Wyoming. And you have two kids or one kid?
I do. I have a son who is
Okay.
20. I don't know how old he is. He's 28, I think. 27, 28. Yeah, and he's a junior right now. He's working on his college degree now.
Oh, cool.
It's good. Trying to be going into engineering.
Oh,
Software
that's cool.
engineering is what he thinks he wants to do. So it's a tough course. So we'll see how he does.
Yeah. So where is he going to school?
It's either SNU or SNHU. Not
Okay.
sure which. Uh, I have a granddaughter who's 6. He
Okay.
has a daughter who's 6.
And Terry disappeared. And
Yeah, I'm trying to find my Bible.
who needs that?
I have one that I write in.
So do you use Logos for your
I do.
work, or you do?
Hmm. Yeah, I've used it for uh, a really long time. My dad actually did some of the resources that are in it from like
Oh wow.
version 1.6. So, but I've been building mine since it's about 20 years that I've been building it. So
Mhm.
I have all my widgets and gizmos and stuff.
Yeah.
It's I don't use three-quarters of the stuff that they put in it.
Yeah.
Like all software companies, they're jamming it full of stuff that nobody wants.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I
yeah.
tried it for a little while. My brother-in-law is using it, but it was pretty hard for him to get into. I just bought Accordance,
Yep.
the and sort of the third tier of Accordance, not too expensive, less
Yeah.
expensive than getting into Logos,
Oh yeah.
and it's I'm finding it a little more user friendly for me.
Yeah. Logos began as a really as a pro tool, and then they tried to add stuff into it that just never panned out. And then they
Mhm.
bought up all of their competition. Um, and that once you have no real competition, I mean, I think Logos is like in terms of Windows market share, Logos is about 90% of it.
Yeah.
And they just bought there was another rival called Word Search. They just bought them out and
Uh,
integrated them. Um, but it's not something that I don't know how anybody would get into it now. I have all kinds of keystrokes and shortcuts and stuff built into mine. So I don't even know 90% of the ways that you're supposed to do things. I
Yeah.
just do them the old way. I just
Yeah.
because I've been using it for so long. I just have all these old things that I do, and
Right.
but it's kind of like Photoshop. Photoshop was started out as Lightroom,
Hmm.
um, and it was just a photo editing software, and now it's so much more, and it's so complicated.
Right.
Um, so there's a huge opportunity for somebody that can do two things: build a Bible study software that a normal person can use, and build a worship service planning software that isn't so complicated that it takes an hour and a half to do one thing. If somebody could just do that, it would be great. So
Yeah.
now people are filtering in.
Tom's here, you
Yeah,
just
I'm
can't see him.
I'm technically Dan. I'm technically a Logos affiliate or something like that. I get some kind of discount.
Oh,
I don't remember, and then I get an
yeah.
academic discount on top of that. So
Yeah, that's great.
so instead of spending $1,000, I spend $950. You know, it's all
Yeah.
about the $50. So
Yeah, I
anyway, I
don't.
told as everybody's filtering in, I'm sitting on the floor because my dog had dental surgery, and I got to make sure he doesn't jump on anything. So he's
It
sitting
looked
here
like he
with
was on
me.
the,
He's over here, and then the other one's guarding me over here.
oh,
So, and I'm the only human in the house. So they gave me this is just a little, doesn't have anything to do with the passage, but so they give me the instructions to take care of him when I pick him up, and the instructions have things like he's going to have a small incision in his private area, and don't let him jump on things for 14 days. I'm reading these instructions. I'm going, he had teeth pulled. They're so busy that they accidentally put the neutering instructions in on my paperwork. And I'm like, I don't. So I talked to the technician. He's like, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. Don't do that. Don't do that. Those are all wrong. So, but yeah, he's still a little loopy, and he just took his pain meds. So I imagine he'll be unconscious until tomorrow. But anyway, all right. So let's see. We got Brian is here, Heather's here, Maureen is here, Damaris's are here, Terry's here. Sandy's not going to be in. Nicole is practicing with Leo. So if you're going to be at church on Sunday, she's doing duets with him. And so that's going to be kind of a cool surprise for people that only my Bible study knows about. And yeah, so why don't we have a word of prayer? And do you guys need me to put the link to the paper in the chat, or does everybody have it?
Please do.
All right,
It's
I
yeah.
I shall
It's
do
still in
so.
the chat.
Yeah. Well, if people sign in after I post it, I don't think it pops up.
Oh, that's right.
So
Sure.
so let's have a word of prayer, and we'll get right into it. Father, thank you for your word and our opportunity to get together, even though it's online. And we just pray that you be glorified as we look to your word. And we ask for your wisdom, your direction. We thank you for your provision for all of us and through all of us to each other. And we pray that you will be exalted, that we would listen to your spirit as we read your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
amen.
All right. So I thought tonight we're gonna be looking at Romans chapter 12, the rest of Romans chapter 12, and so I thought what we do today is we're gonna kind of go section by section, but the guide has a little bit more in terms of interactive questions for you guys. And I feel like going back over the videos and stuff, I've incrementally been talking more and more and more and more and asking fewer and fewer questions. And so I really want to have kind of a conversation over the principles of what we're studying. So we're going to start with Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. We're just going to start with that one verse, and then we're going to be taken off some bigger chunks. But I'll read this one, and then we'll give opportunities for others to read. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And one of the things that happens, one of the interesting things, the difference between English and Greek, in Greek, it's high style if you can use the same word multiple times in a sentence. Whereas in English, we would consider that repetitive and actually kind of a poorly written sentence. In Greek, you want to try to use the same word as much as you can and kind of develop a rhythm. And so I put a transliteration of it, of this verse, in the guide, and his use of the Hebrew word phroneo, which phroneo means to think in the sense of to consider or think about, to process, to evaluate, right? And so there's different words for thinking in Greek, and this is kind of a internal value assessment. I look at something and I realize it's like, oh, okay, that's what that has this quality, right? And excuse me. So as Paul is constructing this sentence, he uses this word phroneo 4 times. And the translation that I kind of did, which is an awful English translation, but I wanted to kind of get the vibe of how he does it, is this: do not hyperthink of yourself more than you should think, but think of yourself with healthy, honest, or sober thinking. Right? So he uses this idea of thinking 4 times, and he says huperphroneo, which is like overthink. Don't think too much of yourself, is really what he's saying. Don't think of yourself more than what you actually are. And then he says, when you think of yourself, make a healthy, honest, sober assessment. So sober, today we use sober in contrast to drunk, but sober means thinking. All right, it comes from the same Latin root as saber, to think, to know. All right, and so he's basically saying, be thinking the way you actually are rather than the way you think you are. And evaluate your own abilities and your place in the church honestly and realistically. So I want to take a minute to kind of discuss some situations that maybe we might hyperthink or overvalue, or we see that elsewhere. We create that hyperthinking about ourselves, overvaluing ourselves. And I want to think about what might cause this. What might cause somebody to hyperthink, to overthink their value? And then what are some ways that God would use his people, his word, his spirit to correct that kind of tendency? So this is we don't necessarily have to talk about ourselves. We can deal abstract or we can deal specific. But why would somebody tend to overthink their contribution, their role, their gifts, their abilities? Where would that come from? And then we can talk about how we might correct it.
Flattery.
Okay, flattery. Okay. Which generally comes from other people, right? You're the greatest. Heather, you're the greatest.
Sometimes I've seen the new shiny penny get a lot of attention. So you have a new family that comes into the church and they're lifted up, for some reason as, oh, the new people, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. The new shiny penny.
That sense.
Yeah.
If somebody knows, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just thinking, what if you are constantly surrounding yourself, where you, I'm just thinking, not even out in church or whatever, but maybe you're smart, you're in a situation where you have more education or more whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So wherever the case may be, where you're surrounding yourself by people that maybe don't have that same level of whatever it is that you think you're better at, and you just always do that. So by comparison, you just always think you're better.
No, that's a great one. I hadn't thought of that one, Heather, but there are people who, and whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, they tend to surround themselves with people that don't have the same expertise as they have, so they're constantly being told how great they are. The big fish in a small pond kind of a thing, where oh, I'm fantastic. I could almost call it the Michael Scott problem, right? So Michael Scott's a great salesman in a small regional paper company, but never in the office. But he never, as soon as he gets out into the real world, he realizes he's not very good at what he does. So that's a good one. Brian, you were going to say something?
Yeah, when somebody is just learning something and he knows a little bit about it, he tends to overestimate how much he really understands of it. It's
Yeah.
only after you've been around in it for a long time you start to realize how much you don't know.
Yeah, that's a good one too. One of the reasons the scriptures talk about a pastor not being a novice, because everybody believes they know everything when they first start learning about something, and then you discover it's not until you know how to be wrong that you actually understand what you're dealing with. So that's a great point.
Yeah. So if you
Right.
never try to learn new things or better yourself, even you kind of, you stay on that thing. It's still like, well, I'm the expert at this because
Yeah.
I've learned all that I can here, versus
Yeah.
going towards something.
Yep. Define the world by your horizon is what I used to call that. Where, somebody down on the ground, they say, well, the whole world is corn. If you're on the ground in Iowa, the whole world is corn, and I can see why the world is flat. But get up on the mountains and you realize that's not how it is. But they define the world by their horizon. Yeah, that's a good one. I think those are all great ways that people overthink. I think there's some others. I mean, they're tied to this. When nobody gets feedback or listens to feedback, right? If they never hear what's going on, then they're going to create a feedback loop in their head of how good they are at something, and they're going to constantly think, oh, I'm so incredible at this thing. And then I think there's also, we tend to overthink our role when no one else steps up. So thinking of it from a positive point of view, when you're, not necessarily a sinful thing, but you're the only one doing something, then I'm the best at what I'm doing because no one else wants to do it, right? So there are all these things that we might overthink our contribution. And although we tend to pick on pastors for doing that, kind of the dictator pastor who decides everything about everything all the time, but the truth of the matter is that can happen at any point. Anywhere in any relationship, we can overthink and overvalue ourselves. So how do we correct that? How do we bring it back to reality? So if we think about the examples that we threw out, what are some ways that God might use His Word or His people or His Spirit to correct our overthinking?
Pride goes before a fall.
All right, pride goes before a fall. Falling definitely should correct overthinking. Doesn't always, but it should, right?
I mean, the scriptures teach us to prefer others before ourselves and to be a servant and not to serve others.
Yeah. And sometimes rediscovering a biblical principle that we've forgotten or got lost in the haze of the idea of service. I mean, what about spouses?
Oh, boy.
Spouse ever used as a correction?
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Probably the primary agent God uses for most married people to keep them in check is their spouse.
Amen.
And some people don't like that, but it's a necessary function of marriage, of that long-term relationship, right? You have to evaluate that. Leadership, exposing ourselves to other things. I have a I don't know if I call it issue or a challenge or what to call it. But since I've been a kid, I've always managed to somehow be the smartest person in the room. And some of that is, to be honest, it's just I'm really good at pretending like I know what I'm talking about. So you can never tell whether I do know what I'm talking about or if I'm just pretending. But the forcing yourself to go do something that you're not comfortable with, that you have to be at the bottom of the rung, is a kind of a self-care way of correcting this attitude. Going out and finding something that you know nothing about and learning it gets you to understand how off the rails you can get and overthink your value and overthink your priority. Some other ways, right? Letting somebody else do it. Letting somebody else do what you think you're the best at, and then being smart enough to see when they're better at it than you, and recognizing that's a humbling experience. I think all of us at some point have a humbling experience of encountering the person that is better at what we think we're the best at. And we go, well, okay, you can either be demoralized by that or you can be encouraged by it, because it means God is preparing somebody else to take that responsibility and working in you. Any other thoughts on that?
I was just going to say, in the world of employment, we're frequently taken down a peg or two.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes.
For sure. And I mean, a lot of times it's sample size, right? So, and when we talk about in the church, right, the church tends to be either small or large. There tend not to be in-betweens. So there's something we call the critical mass. And I've read more church growth literature than I ever will ever use, because most of it's not applicable to the way we do things. But there's a point around 300 people, right, in a church, where the inertia of the church takes over, and the church has to keep growing or it will start to wither. And that's really the kind of the break point of where things start growing into those big multi-site, multiplex, big churches. And so there's really kind of small churches and big churches. You never hear about medium-sized churches. There's always churches that are around 200 and below, and then churches that are 700, 1,000 and above, right? And that's an interesting dynamic, because what it means is there's a space where there aren't enough people to be able to evaluate how good you are at something. And then there's a space where there are so many people that you can't evaluate how good you are at something, and so in the church, it's also often difficult for us to figure out where we fit in that dynamic. And so Paul is just reminding the church, look, you have to be honest in evaluating yourself. And the tools we use to evaluate ourselves are failure, like Brian was talking about, when we fail. If you fail, all right, and that is a signal, well, I failed. That's it. I'm done. It's over. I'm never going to do this again. Well, what does that say about your attitude about your value in that process, right? Obviously, you're taking yourself way too seriously in that situation. Whereas when we take failure and we look at it and we go, okay, I failed. How can I improve? How can I be better at this? How can I help somebody maybe that's better at it than me? Those are kind of situations that we have to be honest. So how can we see ourselves as we are? And we talked about some of those things. But what are some ways that we see ourselves as we are? and we can kind of throw a couple of ideas on, and then we'll go to where Paul is taking us with this one. How can you help yourself and others see themselves or yourself as you actually are, thinking of yourself honestly?
As already mentioned, spouses can help you with that.
Mm-hmm.
And also Bible says there's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. So if you have others that you are working with and who will give you honest feedback and stuff, they can help a lot.
Yeah. And there's an important step in those relationships of giving others permission to speak into your thinking. Saying to somebody, I want to hear, and then actually listening, which is often very hard because somebody criticizes you, even somebody that loves you, and they offer you a critique of something you do. Human reaction is to defend ourselves rather than to say, okay, I'm going to receive this in the spirit it's being given and process it. And that's a process. But whether it's a spouse or one of those friendships, the friendship of brothers and sisters in Christ who are given the permission to speak into your life, and then you are given permission to speak into their lives.
I think Dan has even said too, like serving others too is a humbling experience too. So I think that's another one that helps you, relationally bring yourself back to where you should.
Yeah, absolutely.
And on
go ahead.
On the idea of comparison, like before I was talking about, putting yourself in positions for comparison and stuff like that. I think sometimes for me, like just praising God, right? Like looking at him and for who he really is and everything. So by comparison, that humbles me as well. So constantly keeping in my mind relationally and comparatively in that regard is a humbling thing as well, which should be done all the time, I think. But
yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, makes sense. So, could we have somebody read verses 4 through 8? Romans 12, 4 through 8.
I'll read it. I have the New International Version tonight, 4 through 8. Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we are many. We who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given us. If a man's gift is prophesying, let him use it in proportion to his faith. If it is serving, let him serve. If it is teaching, let him teach. If it is encouraging, let him encourage. If it is contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it is leadership, let him govern diligently. If it is showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully.
Okay, good. Thanks. So when we look at this, first thing I want to draw attention is that Paul, when he's talking about the practical reality of the church, he's going to use the illustration of a body. Now, elsewhere, Paul describes the church as the body of Christ, and he gets more into depth in this. But here, he's just using this as a connection point for people. So he's just saying, you have one body, you're one body, and a body has many members. So, and everybody knows that every member, not all members are different. Now, elsewhere, he goes through the conversation of, can a foot do what an eye can do? Why does a foot say, why do I want to be an eye? He goes through all of these things. But here, he just is using this concept of unity, this concept of the body. And what do you think the advantage of thinking of ourselves, what is the advantage of thinking of ourselves as members of one body? What's the advantage of thinking in those terms?
Y'all need each other.
Okay.
That what I do affects somebody else, and what somebody else does can affect me.
Mm-hmm.
Strength in numbers.
Strength in numbers, okay.
That we can rely on each other, for
Mhm.
things.
What
Wanna
is
take
what is
care of each other.
yeah, what is true of the blood that goes to every part of a human body? Is there
all the-
separate bloods?
It's all the
Uh,
same blood.
All the same blood. What controls the nerve reactions and responses of every single member of the body?
Brain.
One brain. All right. So when Paul talks about us being members of a body, he's saying not only are we dependent upon each other and we balance each other out and what I do affects it, but we draw our power and our energy and our source all from the same place. And so in a sense he's countering the argument, right? So remember what Romans is about. Romans is about the Jews and the Gentiles are struggling to fit together as the church in Rome. And so his points are it's all about Jesus and everybody has access to the gospel. So now in a practical reality church, he's saying the Jews and the Greeks, the Jews and the Romans, the Jews and the Gentiles, we're all members of one body. So the pieces will fit together. And when we think of ourselves as members of one body, both on a local level and on a global level, it frees us from overthinking our role, our responsibility. Any of you guys had an injury that caused compensation? That your body started to compensate because of the injury? Like a knee is weak, and so I had when I was a kid, I broke my leg. It's a long story, but I jumped off an embankment pretending to throw a grenade at a car, and I broke my leg, and I was on crutches, right, and I had a cast and all that kind of stuff, and what I found was I was actually doing damage to the other foot because I've never been a little guy, right? So my wife was all excited because she hit a particular weight, the target weight that she's been going for, and I laughed at her and I said the last time I was that weight was 6th grade, and she said no, that don't be. I was like, no, I'm very serious. I have not been as a grown man. I've never been below 175 pounds since 6th or 7th grade, and so I'm a pretty heavy guy, so I'm sitting on that one leg the whole time, and I actually started to fracture the bones in the other foot, just like tiny little cracks that were causing pain because all my weight was on that foot. We compensate, right, when the body's out of balance. And a lot of our overthinking tends to be from a body that's out of balance, that the members aren't all functioning the proper way. And so, I mean, ultimately, when you have a part of your body that's not functioning properly and they can use a medication to balance it out, sometimes they have to adjust the dosages. Why do they have to adjust the dosages? Because they want to get the body balanced. They don't want to overwhelm another part of the body to fix it. They're trying to find a balance for everything. And so we think about the body, we think about how it all fits together. All right. And then in verse 6, he says, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. And he actually opened in verse 3 talking about the grace that was given to him. Paul says, I'm going to speak to you from the grace that's given to me. So the question that grows out of this, right? So verse 3, for by the grace given to me, I say. And then verse 6, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. The question that I want to ask is, does Paul see himself as above the church as the apostle, or is he part of the church?
Part of the church.
He's part of the church. The humility of Paul in understanding that his role as an apostle was not to hover above the church and speak down to it, but to speak in it, all right, to speak to it from the inside. It's such a significant thing because so often people in leadership or authority elevate themselves above whatever they're leading. I've used this illustration before, but until Vatican II in the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Church had no definition of non-clergy. All right? They did not exist as far as Roman theology worked. Roman Catholic theology was defined the church only as the priests. There was no definition of the laity. The average person in their function was to be the people that the priests ministered to. So they had to kind of create a definition. And that's a huge oversight, because I think in the Bible there's a very clear definition of who the church is. It's not a hierarchy of the priests or pastors or elders or bishops or whatever, and then just a bunch of communion fodder, right? But rather the church is one thing, and they're all members, and every member has a function, every member has a place, and one is not better than the other or higher than the other. And so you can see the implications that it has for authority in the church. How many of you guys have ever been in a church where there was a board that made all the decisions and they controlled the whole situation without ever talking to anybody? If you've been in a church where a pastor makes all the decisions and your voice doesn't really matter, you just have to conform. If you've been in that kind of thing, you immediately go, yeah, this is not healthy. This is not right. This authority structure is a little screwy. What's going on here? I remember being in a church one time, and somebody asked a question in a business meeting, and the moderator said, this is not a church I was pastoring, but the moderator of the meeting said, jokingly, he said, well, it doesn't matter what we decide. I'm trying to remember what it's called. It wasn't deaconesses, but it was like the women's auxiliary. That's what it was. He said, whatever decision we make, the women's auxiliary will really decide how this will be done. Right? And it was kind of like, it was just going ahead and admitting that there was a shadow government that ruled this church. And that there was like, didn't matter what you voted, there was somebody else in charge. But the scripture says that authority really is a function of the body. It's not above the body. And I think that's an important principle that Paul's making a point of. And it manifests here when he starts giving the list. So this list that he gives, I think it's interesting the way that Paul does it. And in the handout, I kind of changed it to one who prophesies, one who serves, one who teaches, one who exhorts. That's really how it's written in Greek. Again, English has this problem of we will have a word that is like a substantive. So a substantive is a word where something has weight. So holiness is a substantive, right? So holiness is substantive. Holy, the word holy, is attributive, which means it's an attribute. So we have those words, but then when we go to have a person who is holy, our word for them is a saint, right? So English has this weird thing where we don't carry through. Our words don't have morphological unity. Greek does. So when you read in Greek, you read if you prophesy, or in this passage when we read the line if prophecy. All right, the English word is, or the Hebrew word is, the one who is prophesying, not a prophet. All right, prophet is prophetess. This is propheteus. It's the one who prophesies. So it's not talking about being a prophet, but rather giving prophecy. If service, that's if one serves. All right, if one who is serving, if one teaches, if one exhorts. Right, he goes through that list. As we go down through that list, let's consider them not as gifts to the individual. People tend to read lists of gifts in the Bible and they go, oh, I have the gift of service, or I have the gift of giving, or I have the gift of this, or the gift of that. And I think I've told this story, but when I was the assistant pastor of a church in Litchfield, the pastor gave us these spiritual gifts inventories. And it was like a SAT. You had to fill in the circles like an answer, the sheet, and then they read it and they told you what your spiritual gift was. And I said to him, I said, which spiritual gift do you want me to have? Because I know which questions to answer to get the answer you want. So if you tell me you want me to have the gift of prophecy, I can answer these questions. I was like, or do you want me to answer honestly? Right? Because if you want me to answer honestly, I'm going to wind up having none of these. Because there were questions like, I don't know if any of you have ever done this. They're questions like, how strong is your desire to share the gospel with people? And it's like, I have a very strong desire. I have no desire at all. Well, who's going to answer that one? Oh yeah, I have zero desire. I'm just going to cross that one. Obviously, everybody's going to try to get as far over to the extreme side of that as they can because it's a leading question, and that's how you know that those tests were. Sometimes you just look at them and just go, "This is." I know where this question's going. My favorite was I have an overwhelming desire to meet the needs of others, and it was like rated on a 1 through 5. It's like 5 was it's like a consuming desire to meet the needs of others, and 1 was something like I couldn't care less what happens to other people. And I just did 1 because I was like, I'm just gonna mess with the score here. Gifts are, it's not I have the gift, but rather these are gifts that God gives to the church through us. All right. So if one has the gift of leadership, the responsibility of one who has the gift of leadership is not to write big vision statements and send out memos explaining things, but to lead people in the way that Christ is calling them. All right. If somebody has the gift of mercy, that's not, whenever you're in trouble and you need forgiveness, go find the person that has the gift of mercy because they'll forgive you. All right. That's not what that is. The gift of service is not, that person has a gift of service. We're just going to put them on every service team that we have in the church. All right. They are gifts that the Holy Spirit gives to the church through people. And so that has an implication for how a local church would function, right? So if a local church doesn't have somebody that has been given a particular gift, all right, that means that at that moment, the ministry has to operate without that gift. We tend to try to force kind of a cookie cutter mold on churches and say a church has to have this ministry, this ministry, this ministry, this ministry. So we need a leader for this. And so if you don't have somebody, let's say pastoral care is a good one, right? So if you don't have somebody who has that kind of Nicole love for people, and I say Nicole because she has this. And I tell all the time about how she will crawl into the bed with somebody who's dying and sing songs to them as they pass away. I mean, Nicole is like an intensely caring person in that physical caring sense, while I'm standing there with my arms crossed. But if you don't have somebody with that, then if you try to force someone to do that job, is it going to be a healthy situation?
No.
It's not.
No.
I mean, it's just not going to be. It's like, I know we don't have anybody that can work with kids, but we do have somebody who's available who doesn't like children, but they're available, so we're going to put them in charge of the children's ministry. And let's just see how it works. Let's see what happens, right? You don't do that. You have to allow the church to be a composite of the gifts that God gives. And if we don't allow the church to be what actually is in the church, then we're going to have a problem, right? And so it's a curious situation because when you run into a question like one of the big hot questions in the church today, the whole idea of diversity and representation, right? And Ryan could probably speak to this better than I could. But Bedford Road can barely clap. So we are probably not the greatest church to start bringing hip hop into the worship service. All right. Would you agree on that one, Ryan? Not a good plan. This is not a good option. Right? We are, as much as we hate this idea, Merrimack is a white suburban town, and that is the makeup we have. And so we try to find a little bit of balance. However, if the population shifted and suddenly the congregation was composed mostly of people that's their worship vocabulary, and we continued to do Michael Card songs and continued to do, not that people don't love Michael Card, and we stopped speaking the vocabulary of the people, and stopped using the gifts of the people that come in, then we start to become unhealthy. So we have to be aware of that. The first church that I candidated for as a pastor when I was a kid, my daughter just walked in. This church they wanted me to come to pastor the church, to take over the church, because I spoke Spanish. Now, I don't speak very good Spanish, but I spoke Spanish. It was a white, blue-collar church in a town that was 95% Hispanic. And not just Hispanic, it was, I'm going to put this the right way, New York City, Puerto Ricans moving out of the city to New Jersey. All right? That's what that town was. And they're like, well, we need to bring somebody in to minister. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you really think that I was the right guy to be called as pastor of that church? They should have called somebody that was going to minister in that vocabulary with those gifts, right? So we have to always be aware that the church, the body, is going to be a composite of the members that are brought into that body. It doesn't mean that we exclude people. It doesn't mean that we don't experiment, but we have to be aware that God gifts the church what God has for that church, and we have to use the gifts we have. Right? Does that make sense? Seem reasonable?
Yeah, I think about the stretch goals that we often talk about at the office, or taking someone out of their comfort area and putting them in an uncomfortable place so that they can grow. Those sorts of things. You're sort of speaking against that, I think, in terms of the gifts that are given to the church, because it doesn't work out as well. But how does that play into growth in terms of stretching people into things they might not be comfortable with?
Well, I would say there are definitely situations in which people are not using their gifts. And so in those areas, we want to see those gifts exhibited. I think a great example of that is the men's thing, right? So we have a bunch of guys that I think have something to say to the men of the church beyond what I could say. So creating an opportunity to stretch them to see where their gifts are, and I think that you have to be willing to. I think you have to be willing to experiment to find your gifts. We just have to be careful of forcing things that are not giftings. And so I think certainly we want to be able to grow and find where our gifting is. A good example, Tom Hathcote, right? So Tom and I have known each other for like forever and a day. And so I put Tom in charge of, what was it? He's been in charge of everything at one point or another. I put Tom in charge of the kids ministry, all right? So I put him in charge of the kids ministry because we didn't have anybody else. And so he said, well, I'll take it. Yeah. And I'm not speaking out of school here. I'll take it, not a problem. I'll go ahead and do this. And so put him in the role. And about 3 months in, he goes, so when are you going to replace me? Because this is not my gig. You have that immediate, is like just aware of this, and this is not going to be my thing. Now, I happen to actually really love teaching little kids, like from the age of like 5 to 9 or 10. I love being goofy with kids and stuff like that. It's fun for me, but it's not the most immediate need that I have. And I think of it kind of like, same thing with the music. Like, I love music, and I always told Nicole, I was like, if I were ever to, I was like, if anything were to ever happen at Bedford Road and I had to go find another job in a church, I said I wouldn't be the lead pastor. I would want to be the music guy. I was like, that's kind of I'm very comfortable there. You know, and so it's like, but those are my, I guess my lesser areas where I can jump in as opposed to pastoring. But I only found out that I enjoy teaching kids because my dad made me teach junior church when I was like 15, 16 years old. And I discovered that not only do I enjoy teaching kids, I seem to get along with them. You know, we kind of goof around. And for some reason, little kids, some of them, not Jordan. Jordan doesn't like me. But, but, you know, I tend to goof around with the little kids and play around with them and stuff. And so, and so now I do that with Aikido instead of teaching in church. But anyway, so yeah, we have to stretch, you know, obviously we have to stretch and find our gifting. Now, once we found our gifting, we need to minister to our most effective in that gift. And I'll be honest, I struggle with that because I have I have an attention span problem because I will jump from this job to that job to this job to that job to this. And so I tend to take on way too much. And so trying to focus and bear down is not easy for me. Anyway. All right. So let's see. We got a series of commands. This kind of got away from me. Yep.
Are you getting ready to move on? Before you move on.
No, we can stay here. Yeah. No, we can stay here.
I wanted to ask about, you know, there's this repeated measure of faith or proportion of faith that's repeated over and over here. I'm wondering, what does that mean? I guess is what I'm wondering. I've always looked, you know, I read that and I'm like, you know, what is how does that, do I have a greater measure of faith for the gift that God has given me? And is it a measure of faith that's greater than someone else in that particular gift, or is it something else? I don't really know.
Yeah, I think that what he's and so we get proportion. It's actually the Greek word is the word we get analog from. It's analogia. So the word alongside or proportion in space, not in space, but like in scale. So I do think there's an aspect of I think what Paul is trying to say, and I'm not going to be definitive about it, but I think what Paul is trying to say is that given a particular verbal role like prophecy, which is the one he employs, that it has to be in proportion to or along in scale with the marriage or the meeting of our faith and the church's need, right? I'm not sure that that's the best way to put it. But because I have kind of the same question, Dan, so I'm still kind of working it out in my head. It seems to be the idea that, you know, don't overstep with your prophecy, don't overstep with your gift. So in proportion to the need, you know, faith meets the need. When we go over top, when we go beyond, that's when we start to overthink ourselves, and especially in a public thing, a spoken thing like prophecy, which he seems to really mean, in this case, he seems to mean the public teaching of the church, right? So it's this idea of there's those who prophesy and there's those who lead, and there's, you know, so I think that's what he means, but I wouldn't take a bullet for that. You know, it's again one of those things that I can't be concrete. In context, that seems to be meaning like same thing, like according to your grace, you know, in measure. It has to be in measure.
Yeah, well, you said it's sort of I don't know if you said this, but it came across to me as it's almost a limitation rather than thinking of yourself, you know, that you have more faith than you have in this area. Work within the amount of faith that you have with the measure of the gift that you're given, and don't try to go outside of it. You know, don't try to, you know, be more than you are. I get in the context that does make sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, be real about your measure, and I mean the thing is that and again, this is taking in the full context of Scripture and talking about growth and stretching. You know, we have to operate within the boundaries, the parameters that we have in the moment, but then at times those boundaries are expanded. You know, and we have to keep moving out. You know, just a personal example, when we were going through the process of the merger, Leo and I were driving down to the building that is now Bedford Road, and we were still in the process of like trying to set things up, and he and I had a conversation, and he said, well, you will have to become the pastor that this church needs. He said, the pastor you are now is not the pastor that this church needs, so you're going to have to grow into that role, and I believe that you can. And that was, so not just saying to me, you've got to do more, but saying, I have confidence in you that this, you know, God can do this. And so we grow into the faith required for the gifts at the moment. You know, and I look back and I mean, you know, Terry was at Heritage when I first came. Ryan came to Heritage not shortly after. Maureen was at Heritage when I first got there. I've had to grow as a pastor and had to give up some things I really liked in order to, you know, be the pastor of the church that is, rather than the church that I would like it to be. So I think that is kind of the angle he's coming at. You're constantly growing, you're constantly changing, but don't let your head outpace your gifts. You know, don't let your thinking your overthinking of yourself get beyond that. So I think that's what he's saying. I could be wrong. He could correct us all. We get to heaven, Paul's like, what are you guys doing building a systematic theology out of my stuff? What were you thinking? Doing bullet pointed outlines and stuff. But you know, but I think that's where he's going. I do, by the way, I was going to try to get through the whole chapter, but I think I'd rather just finish up in this passage because look at the several that he does not double. All right. So prophecy in proportion to your faith, to our faith, he doesn't double. All right. Everything else is service in our serving, teaching in his teaching, exhortation, which is parakletos, exhortation. That's what he actually opens chapter 12 with. I appeal to you, therefore. That's the same word as exhort. So the one who contributes in generosity, right? Which is an interesting turn of phrase, right? Because he is, excuse me, he's using two different words, and the word that is generosity, I think, and I'm going to have to look it up to be sure, but I'm pretty sure that generosity means the overflowing. So when it becomes full, everything that comes to the top flows over. And so the generosity is you give as God gives you, God gives you and you overflow, you give. But then look at so there's prophecy in proportion to your faith, contribute in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, and this one, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. So look at how he brackets the ideas, how he puts them together, right? So you can watch the kind of the pairings, right? The one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness, that's a really interesting choice that he makes there. So prophecy and faith, we can kind of see that. Contribution and generosity, we can see that. But the one who leads with zeal, okay, you know, you leadership, you want him to have zeal, you want him to overflow. But the one who acts with mercy, with cheerfulness, right? So that's a it's just a curious phrase that he makes there. He says when you do mercy, your cheerfulness should have the same relationship to your mercy as your faith does to your prophecy, as your generosity does to your contribution, as your zeal does to your leadership. It's just an interesting thing, and I think he's speaking back to the reality of Jews and Gentiles being in the church together. So what kind of mercy would be required of a Jew in the church with a Gentile believer? right? The Gentiles are not going to observe the kosher laws. So that means you've got to be merciful in your understanding that when you have a potluck, the Gentiles are bringing pork, right? So you have to be and not just, oh, there's a stupid Gentiles bringing pork to the barbecue again, but to be cheerful that God has poured His grace out upon them, And for the Gentiles on the flip side, looking at the Jews, being merciful and cheerful about the fact that they do things that you think are weird, that they're eating kosher, that they're not doing things on the Sabbath day, that they won't eat meat offered to the idols, all of those things. He says, when you do acts of mercy, do it with cheerfulness. Be cheerful in your treatment. And you know what I think that would be called in the modern day is true tolerance. We can disagree in the church and still be cheerful, and be not just like smile, but cheering on God's work in those that look and sound different than us. And that's an extraordinary thing that Paul says. And he uses the Jews and the Gentiles. We could use all kinds of illustrations for that. All kinds of different things. So I think it's interesting how he does that. And I don't think he does it because he didn't have a word that worked. Right? It's not like he's like, well, I can't say, act with mercy, be merciful. We know that you can do that in Greek. It's not a problem to do that. He chooses not to do it. He says cheerfulness instead.
I have an interesting note in here. It was saying about the last verse, or verse 8, serving the needy should be a delight, not a chore.
Mm-hmm.
All these things should be something that we really enjoy doing.
Yeah. It should be a genuine cheer, and that flows out again of not overthinking yourself, not hyperthinking yourself, right? And he's gonna down below. He's gonna talk about contributing to the needs of the saints, showing hospitality, all these things. The next set of verses is really, really interesting, and I'd encourage you to over the next week, the section on the rest of the chapter. Paul really is. It looks like a series of commands, but it's not. In Greek, it's not. It's in fact, in the opening of verse 9, let love be genuine. There is actually no verb in that sentence at all. All right, the sentence in Greek in verse 9 is love without hypocrisy. That's all it says. And it's not written in such a way that you can insert the verb. Now, we have to do it because otherwise it doesn't make any sense in English. But the whole idea is this is his heading. So, let love be genuine is his heading. And then everything in verses 9 through 13 is a list of things that is genuine love. It is love without hypocrisy, abhorring evil, holding fast to what is good. And then in verse 14 to 18, Paul glosses Jesus. So this is one of the passages where Paul is actually quoting the Gospels all the way through here. All the way through this passage, he's relying at times on the way that Jesus taught, right? But it's layered into the way he speaks, all right, or the way he writes. And so, for example, when he gets to bless those who persecute you, that's a Jesus thing, right? Jesus says, blessed are those, who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, right? He talks about that. All through there, if you go through there, repay no evil for evil. Jesus says, if somebody compels you to walk a mile, walk two. If somebody slaps you on the left cheek, you return the right cheek. All of those things. So Paul is glossing that. So I'd encourage you to go through and look at that. And I put a bunch of verses. I was going to talk about them, but we ran out of time, from the Gospels. But I'm sure you can identify more of Jesus in this line. All right. One of the biggest arguments right now that's going on in theology is Paul did not know the Gospels. So the argument is the Gospels were written after Paul, and so Paul would not have known the Gospels. He would not have known the sayings of Jesus. And that this is one of the arguments that kind of lower the value of the Gospels. They're not, those were written much later. Paul actually implicitly quotes Jesus a lot. All right, he glosses Jesus. And so gloss is a linguistic term. It means that rather than quoting something, you say something assuming the other people know what you're talking about. So when Paul says this, he's saying, you know what Jesus said. Right? That's what he's doing. Rather than directly quoting Jesus, he's saying, you know what Jesus said. You know what Jesus said about your enemies. You know what Jesus said about caring for the poor. You know what Jesus said about this. So it's Paul basically, to be honest, Paul's preaching the way I do. You guys know how I'm terrible with numbers. I can't remember the references of verses. And so I'll say things like, well, you know that Jesus said, and I'll give kind of a gloss of what we actually have in the Gospels, because I'm going off the top of my head. I don't have it written down. And then that's an encouragement for people to go back and say, okay, what did Jesus say in that passage? And rather than me sitting there, now if we turn to Matthew 6, we see Jesus said, glossing is a way of active memory. Now it's not because that's not the reason I do it. I do it because I can't remember. But it's a useful tool for active memory to constantly be glossing the important text and then developing our ideas from them. So that's what Paul does. And I think if you read these verses and think, all right, what did Jesus say about this topic? You'll find a great depth to the way that Paul is writing. This is not emerging from a vacuum. Paul is intentionally glossing Jesus. He's also glossing the Old Testament. He glosses Deuteronomy a couple times in here. Anyway, so I put those in the sheet, and we'll come back to him next week. I'm not going to just skip over it, but because he has a lot to say there. But we're over time, so. So thoughts?
Well, at the beginning of it, when you were saying about instead of who you think you are, what you really are, a quote came to me, "To thine own self be true."
Yeah. Yeah. Which is from? Who knows what's it from? Who knows what's it from?
Hamlet.
It's from Hamlet. That's correct. All right. Well, if you have no thoughts or anything, I'm gonna.
I just
Thank
want
my
to.
buddy. Yep.
I got a text during the hour here, and Sandy Mashula said that Steve Allen does not have a blood clot in his stomach.
Okay. Good.
He announced that.
Okay, because he was in. We didn't send out the thing about the blood clot, but he was in an accident this weekend, and so he was going to the doctor today to make sure that he didn't. They thought they might have a blood clot in his stomach, right? It was in his stomach, yeah.
But it's not.
Yeah, I have a lot to say, Eric, but I mean,
We'll write it down and we'll start with it next week.
I gotta go think of myself more as I ought. So
This is one of the real challenges of the whole Zoom thing. The format really it's difficult to, because of the delays and everything. You can only have so much active conversation and time gets away from us. But yeah,
and having 1 hour is also
yeah, an hour is a tight schedule for the passages that we hit, but everybody else does an hour, and so we have a standing rule that the Bible studies have to last an hour. That's all four of us only do an hour, so
Since
in
when
theory
have you
anyway.
obeyed the rules, Eric?
What?
Since when have you obeyed the rules?
Well, Sometimes they got to be a team player.
Oh, okay.
So-
All right. That's different.
Yeah. Of course, I don't know whether Ray Pouliot follows the rules or not. He probably goes 3 hours, but in theory, we're only supposed to be an hour. So, anyway, all right. So next week we'll pick up in chapter 12. You up, buddy? You moving around? You want to say hi to everybody?
No.
Yeah.
He's
He's still not.
Today.
His meds are his painkiller definitely kicked in, so he's just kind of looping around the house. Anyway, all right. Well, next week we'll pick up in chapter 12. So if you get a chance, please read through this passage, look at the handout on it, and look for more glosses from Jesus, because Paul really is. He's relying upon it, and just because Paul doesn't quote Jesus all the time. And the 2 quotes that he quotes of Jesus are not in the Gospels, but he seems very aware of what is in the Gospels. So it's a fascinating study to go through and find all the places he's quoting Jesus indirectly. So he quotes Jesus as indirectly as he does the Old Testament.
Did you say 12 or 13?
12. We're going to finish up chapter 12.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
Yep. Okay.
It seems odd to me if he spent any time with the disciples, and the disciples were doing what Jesus told them to do, then he would have heard the words of Jesus from the disciples constantly. That would have been about everything they talked about.
Yeah. And Stanley Porter, who wrote a book called Life of Paul, makes a really good argument that Paul would have heard Jesus teach. That he actually was in Jerusalem and had heard Jesus teach. And if he did, Paul's mind is like a steel trap. So if he heard it, it was in there, and he wasn't going to let it go. I mean, keep in mind, this is a guy in those days. In order to reach the rank that Paul did in the Pharisees, he had to have been able to recite the book of Deuteronomy, not just quote it. He had to be able to recite the entire book. So I mean, he's not an idiot. He knows what he's doing. So I imagine that his memory was pretty solid, and so I think he probably heard from the disciples. And he intentionally glosses because he's speaking into a situation where people are already familiar with the passages. They're already familiar with this. They've already heard it. And so I do think that's what he does. So,
I mean, can you imagine having that depth of knowledge in the Old Testament scriptures, and then your eyes being open to see Christ, and then all of that just exploding out of the writings, all that. All about Christ. It must have been absolutely mind-blowing for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons. I think when Peter in 2 Peter says that there's some things about Paul that are hard to understand, because Paul seems to have, like you said, when the trigger was pulled, Paul explodes intellectually. His depth of knowledge of the scriptures and Judaism and all of these things is so extraordinary that he just blows everybody out of the water. And I mean, it happens in Acts, right? You get Paul, his conversion, you get one story of Peter, and then the rest of the book is Paul. I mean, he just takes off and explodes, and he's a rock star. I mean, he really is. He walks think about the fact that the guy walks into Athens and gets challenged to speak at the Areopagus. That's not something you do to a non-professional rhetorician. They looked at him and went, "This guy knows what he's doing. We want to hear his philosophy." They don't understand it when he gives it, but they want to hear it. So he is a heavyweight. Paul is absolutely a heavyweight. I still to this day argue that Paul is probably the most intelligent Bible teacher that ever lived. He's the Einstein of theology. And I think it's one of the big problems of modern Christianity is we think we can figure Paul completely out. I think there are parts of Paul that I would say that we as a modern church cannot get to his level. He's just beyond us. And it's extraordinary that we can understand what we can understand. So
it's really cool that the scales fell from his eyes, right? And then he had eyes to see. That illustration is so interesting.
Yeah. And you want to bet that that was a story he told all the time. He made sure everybody heard it. All right, guys, we're over, so we'll go ahead and shut things down. But by all means, keep thinking this stuff and jotting it down and hitting it, and we'll keep going. All right. Have a great week.
Thanks.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, guys.
Night.
Bye.